Glad you're here. Welcome to Uncle's Lessons. The scent of baked tar and wild chicory. Pull up a chair, son. Lean back. You see that ridge just past the old water tower? If you walk through the briars and the sumac bushes, you'll trip right over the past. It's the old Penn Central branch line, or what's left of it. Nowadays, it's just two streaks of orange rust bleeding into the Ohio dirt, completely swallowed up by Queen Anne's lace and wild blackberries. But if you get down on your knees on a hot July afternoon, right when the humidity is so thick you could slice it with a pocket knife, you can still smell it. It's a mix of old creosote, that heavy black tar they used to soak the wooden ties in, and the sharp, metallic tang of rusted iron. To anybody else, that's just the smell of junk. To me, that was the scent of the world coming to our front door. When I was knee-high to a grasshopper, those tracks were the center of the universe. My daddy used to hold my hand, his palm rough like sandpaper from his shifts at the foundry, and he'd tell me, "Joe, as long as those rails are shiny, Oak Haven is connected to the heart of the world." And they were shiny, son. So bright they'd catch the moonlight like silver ribbons, stretching all the way to Pittsburgh and Baltimore. Day in, day out, the ground would tremble. You didn't need a wristwatch in this town. You timed your life by the trains. The 7:15 coal drag from West Virginia, the noon hot shot carrying manufactured parts up to Detroit, and the 6:40 evening passenger train that smelled like diner coffee and fancy city perfume when it slowed down at the depot. We used to take copper pennies, back when pennies were actually made of real copper, and we'd spit on them for good luck and lay them right on top of the rail. We'd hide behind the big elderberry bushes, hearts pounding in our chests, waiting for the monster to come. When an aggregate train rolled through with 4 diesel engines screaming at the front, the roar was so loud it'd rattle the teeth right in your skull. You could feel the power of America vibrating right up through the soles of your sneakers. The air would turn hot, filled with the smell of diesel exhaust and grinding metal. After the caboose blurred past in a cloud of dust and brake smoke, we'd run out and find our pennies. They weren't pennies anymore. They were smooth, hot, stretched out slivers of copper, bigger than a silver dollar. We carried them in our pockets like tokens from a kingdom we thought would last forever. It was a time when everything felt solid, heavy, and permanent.
The pulse of the Heartland. It wasn't just freight they were moving on those tracks. It was the lifeblood of our people. Every bit of coal that fed the blast furnaces down at the mill came down that line. Every single girder of structural steel we rolled out, still hot enough to burn through heavy leather gloves, was loaded onto flat cars and shipped out on those very same rails. The railroad and the mill were like 2 gears in an old pocket watch. One couldn't tick without the other turning. The railroad men were a different breed back then. They wore those blue and white striped denim caps, and they had hands that looked like they were carved out of solid hickory wood. Old Man Henderson was the switchman at the crossing down on Main Street. He had a wooden leg from a coupling accident back in the 50s, but he could walk those gravel ballasts faster than any young man in the county. He'd stand out there with his yellow stop flag, chewing on a piece of tobacco, waving at every single car that paused at the tracks. He knew everybody's name, everybody's kids, and whose hound dog had run off into the woods the night before. A town without a whistle, Henderson told me once when I was helping him clean the soot off his oil lanterns, is just a place where people are waiting to die, Joe. The whistle means somebody is coming back home, or something grand is being sent out. On Saturdays, the farmers from out toward the county line would bring their old Chevrolet grain trucks to the co-op elevators, right next to the siding. You'd have 20, 30 trucks lined up in the dirt yard, the smell of sweet corn and dry wheat chaff filling the air until you could taste the harvest on the back of your tongue. The men would lean against the rusty tailgates, talking about the weather, the price of hogs, and how the high school football team looked for the upcoming Friday night game. It was a true community, son. It wasn't a corporate market or a demographic or a statistic on some laptop screen. It was real neighbors leaning on neighbors, and that steel railroad track was the long, heavy spine that held the whole thing upright. We took it for the theft of the iron. But you see, the folks in the high-rise offices in Philadelphia, New York, they don't look at spines, they look at spreadsheets. They don't know the difference between a family farm and a gravel pit, as long as the numbers on the bottom line turn green at the end of the fiscal quarter. It started slow. First, they cut the passenger service in '71. They said nobody wanted to ride the rails when the new interstate highway was cutting through the hills. They boarded up the passenger depot, a beautiful old brick building with oak benches and a potbelly stove that had kept 3 generations of travelers warm. Then they stopped maintaining the ballasts. The trains started moving slower, creaking and groaning over the warped wooden ties like an old man with bad hips. The real hammer dropped in the winter of '82, right after the mill went dark. I remember the last train that ever came down this line. It wasn't a long, proud string of cars. It was just a single locomotive pulling 3 empty gondolas and a rusted crane car. They weren't delivering anything. They were here to pick up the spare equipment from the maintenance yard. The engineer didn't blow the whistle when he came through the Main Street crossing. He just rolled through at 5 miles an hour, his head down, looking at his controls. Old man Henderson wasn't there with his flag anymore. He'd passed away the autumn before. There was just a handful of us standing out in the freezing sleet, watching that lone caboose disappear into the gray mist toward the river. When the sound of that diesel engine finally died out, the silence that settled over this valley was heavier than any winter snow. What happened next is what really burns my biscuits. A few years later, a contractor crew showed up from out of state. They had big flatbed trucks and hydraulic loaders. They weren't here to fix anything. They were here to scavenge. They started pulling up the spikes, ripping the heavy steel rails right out of the oak ties to sell them for scrap. They called it asset recovery. I called it grave robbing. They tore up the crossings, paved right over the tracks on Main Street with cheap black asphalt, like they were trying to erase the evidence that we ever existed. They left the wooden ties behind because they weren't worth enough money to haul away. So those ties just sat there, rotting in the rain, splitting open under the summer sun, year after year. But if you think that's the end of the story, you don't know the people of this valley. About 5 years after the tracks were abandoned, those old oak ties turned out to be the perfect shelter for wild blackberry vines. Now, every August, the old folks and the kids head out to the rusted tracks. We're just like these briars, son. We're stubborn, we're dug in deep, and we're still producing something sweet, even when the world thinks we're just an abandoned sideline.